Mills, and I'm checking to see if there's anyone else, and I don't see anyone.
Okay. And Mark, we're down a business rep. Are we gonna start a process to fill that?
We were gonna start that after the first of the year.
Okay,
Because as you know, it can be a little bit challenging to say find those, and so wanted to make sure we were looking for kind of a full slate before we did that. So
sounds good.
we'll be doing that soon.
Okay. Do you have any announcements?
Actually, I do not this morning, so we can move quickly.
Can I get a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved. Second, this is Pete.
Been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? Then that motion unanimously carries. We've approved the agenda. And next up is the consent calendar and approval of the meeting notes, October 9th.
Move approval.
Been moved and seconded. Any discussion there? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? That motion also unanimously carries. Now it's a public comment period, and we do have one person signed up for public comment. I'll turn it over to staff to bring in.
And Berlina, is
Karen.
Karen online?
She is. She's
Okay.
joining us as a panelist right now.
Okay, great. Here she comes. Morning, Karen. You can go ahead when you're ready.
Good morning. Good morning, members of the Policy Board. The Regional Trails Plan was updated beginning in 2021, so it's been a few years, and it was adopted in 2023. It's time to get to work on implementing that plan. Trails benefit our entire region. I often meet people at the Fir Tree Trailhead who have come here from other parts of Washington and other states to ride on our Chehalis Western Trail. They likely stop for lunch in Yelm tonight or Rainier. I know local people who plan their ride to include lunch somewhere at some end of the trail. With the transportation, economic, and health benefits from the trail, it's easy to see how important they are. And this board has been very supportive of trails for a long time. While we need more trails and we need maintenance of trails, there are also management issues to deal with, including safety. It's time to put more effort into coordinating the jurisdictions to work on management issues with the trails, since they all benefit and they all have trails in or near them. Trails benefit everyone, and the region should work together on managing the trail system. The federal funding for TRPC will support staff time to bring trail managers and users together to discuss management issues and other things. Please support the full amount, not the smaller amount that they've now compromised to, but the full amount that TRPC requested to staff implementation of the Trails Plan. We need that kind of effort to keep this trail system flourishing, growing, but also to address issues that we're confronting on the trail with safety as one example. I will say that I'm disappointed that TRPC base work program does not include ongoing trails planning work. This should be a basic part of what TRPC does for transportation planning, just as they work on plans for other roadway systems. But in the meantime, since they need to apply for a grant to get trails work done, please support the funding for trails and support the full amount. It's what you'll see in your packet is a lower amount than what they originally requested. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Karen.
We just lose our chair. Yes, we did. Okay, well, it looks like Oh, good.
And
That was weird. I got kicked off for a second.
So, Chair, maybe you should designate
Yeah.
a second in case that happens again.
Sure. Pete, can you take over for me if that happens again?
yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then let's go into our next agenda item. It's the contingency list edition.
We're bringing it up now, Chair.
All right, good morning, everyone. Katrina Van Every, I'm the transportation manager here at TRPC. And so this should be a fairly short and hopefully easy item for you to take action on today. It's the contingency list and RTIP Appendix A. So the requested action today is to recommend adding TRPC's multimodal level of service phase 2 project to the contingency list. Come on, computer. Okay, so it does not like me to use the buttons. All right. Well, TRPC's contingency list, we have two ways that you can get on it. First off, the contingency list is just a list of additional projects that are able and eligible to receive federal funding. We use that contingency list when we are trying to fill holes or when there's opportunities for additional funding. Redistributive funding is a great example of where we can pull contingency projects off and get funding for it. And there are two ways that funding can come or projects can be added to the contingency list. The typical way you see that is through the call for projects additions, which Paul will talk about later today. This is typically how we do it. And last year we had this new process to look at RTIP Appendix A projects and seeing if those can be added to the contingency list as appropriate. So that's what we're going to concentrate on today, are projects being added through that secondary new process. So again, two pathways we've got available to us. This is kind of what the flow chart looks like, but what we're really concentrating on is those RTIP Appendix A additions. So in the RTIP, which was just adopted or approved in October, there is an Appendix A list of projects that have the ability to receive federal funding or might come up in the next year if a jurisdiction or another agency is able to use it. We have this appendix there just to make it a streamlined process so that it doesn't have, the projects don't get bogged down in procedural actions. So it's there, it's ready to go, and if projects receive funding, they can be added to the RTIP pretty quickly. So the question is, can the project use federal funding within the next 2 years? And if it can, and an agency would like to see it added to the contingency list, we put it forward to you all and to council for consideration. If it can't, if it's not in RTIP Appendix A, if it can't receive or use that federal funding in the next 2 fiscal years, then it wouldn't be added to the contingency list at this time. One thing to note is that projects added to the contingency list from Appendix A have a lower priority for funding than projects added through the contingency list from the call for projects process. So essentially the message is that process that Paul has been going through with the jurisdictions with you all, that is the priority. And so when funding comes available and there might be a cause for us to prioritize what we think needs to receive it, we are going to look back to the call for projects process first. Look at the projects that can move up from the contingency list there rather than the secondary action. So it's still there, still available, but it's a lower priority. So the requested action today is to add TRPC's multimodal level of service phase 2 project to the contingency list. We are currently going through phase 1, which identifies feasible options for measuring multimodal level of service and integrating that into a tool for the region's approach to transportation planning. Phase 2 is really just to support the adoption. If you all get to that point and decide it's a good idea, we would support the adoption and implementation of that regional multimodal level of service. The scoring criteria that we use comes from the current call for projects process. Just like the call for projects process, or projects that are looked at for consistency with our regional goals and objectives and focus areas, we look at these secondary and contingency list projects in the same light. And so the scoring criteria that come from the current call for projects process are active transportation, efficient use of federal funds, equity, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, safety, and sustainable Thurston urban corridors and centers. So when you look at those criteria from the call for projects process, this project would score a 4. And so that is the score that we are proposing giving it. It would be recorded with the addition to the contingency list. And if there is a need for us to prioritize, that would play a factor into that prioritization. So again, the requested action today is to add this one project to the contingency list. This is a new process. It's the first time we've done it. And because it's also a call for projects process here, you're probably not seeing other projects other than from TRPC because of that. So that's great because we want those projects to go through the call for projects process first. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
And I guess I'd just add before questions, one of the reason that this project we're putting through this process is so that it's a lower priority. We knew it wouldn't compete well in the call for projects, but if there's an opportunity for redistributed federal funds, this could be a good candidate because it can obligate quickly. And so that is why strategically this will be on the contingency list, be a lower priority, but if there ends up being redistributed opportunity, this could be a project to help us take advantage of that.
Okay, are there any questions?
Andy, I do have one. So I see it's on our list in the next consideration for grants here in our next agenda item. The multimodal study is already there for 2025 on funding. So are you anticipating that something might come down between now and then? Is that why this is moving so quickly? I didn't quite understand that.
So the project is in 2 phases and phase 1 is currently underway and going fairly at a good clip. And so the thought is that if redistributed funding comes available next year that we could utilize this for, we can start lining it up for that secondary phase.
Because under the call for, this is a call for projects for 28 to 30.
Oh, I see.
And the redistributed funding opportunity is really over the next 2 years.
Okay,
And so that's the thinking
Okay.
there.
so this is,
If redistributed is an opportunity and no other projects can take advantage of it, this could go earlier.
okay. All right, got it. Thank you.
In the meantime, phase 1 is continuing.
And phase 1 is continuing.
I would move approval of requested action.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Is anyone opposed? Then that motion unanimously carries. Okay. Next up on our agenda is our 2024 federal transportation call for projects funding recommendation. Paul.
Good morning, Transportation Policy Board members. I'm Paul Brewster, Senior Planner at Thurston Regional Planning Council. Today we are, this is your final touch point on the 2024 call for projects. And your decision today is momentous. It will have real big impacts for years to come, as Katrina just alluded to, and Mark, programming projects out through 2030. So what are we here to do? In 2022, we revised our call for projects process to develop a point-based, performance-based, competitive, transparent call for projects. We've done that. Katrina outlined the equity that we use, the project evaluation criteria we use to evaluate projects, and I'll just rattle those off again. Active transportation, equity, efficient use of federal funding, greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable Thurston urban corridors and centers, and safety. We want to maximize our federal allocation of grant funds to impactful projects that align with our region's funding priorities, and program those projects that are shovel ready, so that TRPC continue to meet our obligation target, which is critical for us to continue receiving allocations of funding. But also in alignment with the presentation Katrina just gave, it positions TRPC and our member agencies to receive additional federal funding. And that's why we put projects on the contingency list, to be positioned for redistributed funding. So an example of that, just this year, because we met our obligation targets, we were able to receive nearly another $5.2 million for the City of Olympia's Phones Road project. So this year in 2024, we have a little over $19 million to program for the carbon reduction program funding and the congestion mitigation air quality improvement program funding. We're programming out 2025 through 27. And for our surface transportation block grant and transportation alternatives, we're programming out 28 through 2030. We receive allocations based on geographic area. That light green in the center is our urban large area. The pink dashed line is our air quality maintenance area. That's the area that we must program our CMAQ funding to. The lighter green moving out from the urban core is our rural area, and those two dark green patches for the Rochester Grand Mound area and a portion of the city of Yelm is our urban small. So as you can see, based on this bar graph, the largest allocation is to our urban large area. And that in white for STBG and transportation alternatives is flexible funding. That funding can be spent anywhere. I'm just going to give a spoiler alert here. Most of that urban small allocation is really going to projects in the city of Yelm, because that we must program that urban small allocation, and Yelm has a project that can satisfy the eligibility requirements among these various grant programs. So you did identify 2 priority set-asides. I'm just noting, this is not the latest PowerPoint presentation that I have here. So I'm just observing that out loud. There must have been some mix-up when it got added to this laptop, but we'll go with it. So you've identified in the 2022 process that the Rural Community Support Program is a priority. You set aside $600,000 in STBG flexible. This funding is going to a Thurston County project. In turn, Thurston County agrees to make $550,000 available in non-federal revenue for local agencies. And that's our Rural Community Support Program partners are Rainier, Tenino, Bucota, and the Confederated Tribes of the Chehalis Reservation and the Nisqually Indian Reservation.
And the reason for that is it's easier to manage local money than
Yeah.
it is federal money.
That's right. The saying is it's much easier to get federal funding than it is to spend it. And these the smaller communities don't necessarily have the staff resources to really adhere to WSDOT's local agency guidelines to be able to use that federal funding. And so this Rural Community Support Program funds small but impactful projects in the communities. And then the second set aside is for the Regional Shared Use Trail Network pavement preservation. $1 million in CRP funds, up to $1 million in CRP funds is allocated.
Lena's pulling up your latest, if you want to switch to that, and then you
Sure.
could just say
Yeah,
next
yeah.
slide, please.
Yeah.
If you could stop
I'll
sharing,
do that.
she will start sharing.
If you could go to number 2, let's start with number 2, Berlina, if you can hear me. Yeah, thank you. Let's start here and then we'll jump ahead after this. So what I wanted to do is just bring you to where you've been in this process. So in March, you really kicked off the call for projects with the discussion about the trail preservation set aside. This is something that the TPB has been discussing since prior to our 2022 call for projects, and I'll give credit to Pete Komet, who has really been advocating for the need to establish a maintenance fund to maintain our trail network. In April, you started digging into the details of how much funding we have to program. We introduced 2 new criteria, active transportation and safety, and you discussed the role of a TPB subcommittee and digging deeper into reviewing the projects and forming a recommendation that we are going to present to you today. In May, you approved the call for projects process and recommended the council move forward with it. We initiated that call in June. Applications were due in July. The TAC has reviewed the proposals. In September, I gave you an overview of all 3 rural community support program proposals and the 19 federal proposals. And in October, the TPB subcommittee consisting of Chair Ryder, Intercity Transit Authority Representative Justin Belk, Community Representatives Murray and Millar, and City Council Member Robert Vanderpool served on the subcommittee and reviewed the proposals and helped shape the award scenarios that I'm presenting to you today. And today, of course, we're seeking your action to council on a funding recommendation. Next slide. And you can skip this one. Just keep on clicking through this one. And skip this one. And this one. And now we're on track. Thank you, Berlina. Okay, this slide here shows the amount of each of the federal and rural community support program funds we have available, the total proposals we received, the requested funding. What I want to illustrate with this slide is the funding gap. The challenge of the TPB subcommittee was to try to reconcile that 4,845,380 funding that we don't have to program to projects. Next slide. So the subcommittee dug into this. Just click through these, Berlina, thanks. So they reviewed the proposals. So they had an opportunity, the applicants participated in the meeting. Subcommittee members had a chance to engage, ask questions about the proposals, seek clarity. Keep on clicking, Berlina. They validated the project scores, focusing on issues that were brought up during the tax review. Things that Katrina and I had questions about on our own criteria because we introduced active transportation and safety in this year's process. And there was some gray areas that we needed some policy direction on. And then the subcommittee ranked the proposals, prioritized projects for funding and recommendations next, and gave staff feedback on guiding those award scenarios I'm presenting to you today. Next. So we're going to talk about the results of 6 projects that they looked at, 3 different criteria where there were some questions. Let's go to the next slide. So the first up is the City of Lacey's College Street Corridor Improvements Phase 3. This pertained to the active transportation criteria. Applicants scored their own proposals and then staff reviewed them, the TAC reviewed them. There was a question about the active transportation, and the subcommittee thought that to be aspirational with the active transportation criteria, a project such as this with a major corridor reconstruction, reconfiguration, that they recognize that there's great new wider sidewalks, improved pedestrian crossings, but it lacked bicycle infrastructure on the corridor. And because of that, the subcommittee believed that the project warranted 1 point, but not 2. This wasn't a big change in the overall rankings. It reduced the project from 12 to 11 points and positioned this project in 3rd place for urban large STVG proposals. Next slide. On this one, Thurston County Old Pacific Highway, Coleman Road intersection improvements. This is a new intersection that will be constructed with roundabouts, with the roundabout and sidewalks. The county scored 2 points for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions with the intent that the walking trips would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the subcommittee's discussion focused that these pedestrian improvements are only located at this intersection. And although eventually this corridor will be developed with sidewalks as funding allows and the need arises, the change in the configuration at this intersection and the new sidewalks really isn't going to increase the share of walk trips to the extent that that share of walk trips is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the project went from 2 points for greenhouse gas emissions to 1 for a total score of 9. Really no change in the ranking on this one overall. Next slide. So this is Thurston County's Tilley Road Bridge replacement. This is a bridge that presently is functionally obsolete. It doesn't have wide shoulders. It's going to be constructed with wide shoulders, and the county believed it should earn 1 point for active transportation. Our active transportation criteria really didn't do as good of a job at looking at rural projects and what would be appropriate for rural projects to support active transportation. So it was silent on including shoulders in the criteria. The subcommittee believed that having wide shoulders on both lanes warrants 1 active transportation point because that does support bicycling and walking along that corridor and provides a continuous wide shoulder without any disruptions. So overall, this didn't change the total score in its ranking for the rural STVG proposals. Next slide. This last one on the score validation is all 3 Thurston County Chehalis Western Trail Preservation projects. We did not, our criteria explicitly stated, and it was really focused on for active transportation on road repaver projects. That road repaver projects didn't warrant any safety points. However, the subcommittee believed that the primary intent of repaving a trail is to improve safety, to reduce those tripping hazards. And as such, the county didn't claim 1 point, but the subcommittee believed it earned a point. So it gained a point each for the urban and the rural portions of their trail proposals. Didn't change the overall ratings for carbon reduction in TA. And although these 6 projects they reviewed really didn't shake up the overall ranking, it did give the subcommittee some insights into our criteria. Things that as we go into our 2026 call for projects, the TPB will have a little more insight and ownership and accountability and how we can improve our criteria scores for future calls for projects. Next slide. So here, I'm just going to give you an overview of our process and do the comparison of the award scenarios 1 and 2. Next slide. So for award scenario, go ahead and click one more time. The subcommittee believes that to maintain our performance-based process, we're going to use our scores and ranking to inform ranking and award decisions. So those scores really really do reflect alignment with regional funding priorities. And so the projects are ranked from highest to lowest by grant program and then by the urban large, urban small, rural areas. The outcome of this is that in the recommendations, full funding is provided for the highest ranked proposals, and as funding allows, partial funding for lower ranked proposals. And I want to point out here that we did contact all of the applicants where the recommendation includes a partial award. And so for scenario 2, where there is a reduced award, the applicants have confirmed that they can successfully implement the projects at that funding level. Next. We want to maximize our federal funding, so we want, where possible, reallocate other eligible grant funding to projects. So for example, Intercity Transit submitted their Smart Corridors Phase 4 for a carbon reduction program grant, but we had $5 million in CMAQ allocation to award this go round. That project is eligible to use CMAQ funding, so we awarded it CMAQ funding. So this really allows us to leverage that flexible funding to our rural and urban small areas that don't receive as large of a share of federal grants to program projects. And so what this does is it really just allows us to maximize and award all the available federal funding that we have. Next. And then the subcommittee really wanted to focus on leveraging that trail preservation set aside. Although there were 4 carbon reduction program proposals, 2 of which were for the trail, the subcommittee thought it was really important to adhere to that funding priority, that trail preservation was the best fit for using the carbon reduction program funding. And so all of the urban large and rural carbon reduction program funding is awarded to a consolidated Chehalis Western Trail Preservation Project. The share of urban small is awarded to Yelms Roton Road Project. And one more click here, Berlina. And then for scenario 2, the subcommittee thought it was really important to consider other projects, other benefits and impacts, that the scores alone don't always account for all the impacts and benefits that projects can provide. Our intercity transits projects don't score as well in our process. That's something we want to take a look at. Katrina just mentioned, like, if the multimodal level of service project was submitted in our call for projects process, it would only score 4 points. The regional trails plan implementation proposal only scored 5 points. However, the subcommittee thought it was really important to provide funding for the regional trails plan to get that work going. And so the scenario 2, there is a partial funding recommendation for the regional trails plan. Next slide. So here's the ranking of the projects. You're going to see several other tables like this. It will look a little redundant, but I want to emphasize here is here's the ranking of the projects by grant program and area. For example, for the Surface Transportation Block Grant, the 6 STBG urban large proposals we have are ranked here. We don't need to spend too much time focusing on this. I just want to emphasize that all the remaining slides you see with the project funding recommendations are going to follow this ranked order. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through the baseline scenario, and this baseline scenario, recall, we are providing maximum awards to the highest scoring projects and partial awards to the lower scoring projects. So starting with the urban large, the Martin Way Corridor project, the Pacific Avenue enhanced crosswalks, and the Lacey College Street improvements phase 3, those top 3 proposals in scenario 1 would receive their full grant requests. We then have no more, we don't have enough urban large funding to fully fund Thurston County's Old Pacific Highway Coleman Road intersection improvements. So we awarded what Funding remains plus a share of STBG flexible to come up with that 1.6 million award you see there. So Thurston County receives 327,784 less than its full request. That program's out all 6,600,000 in available STBG urban large funding. As a consequence, in this scenario, both the Thurston County Meridian Road, Mullen Road intersection improvements and the Trustor Road mobility study, there's no funding to award them, so no awards for them. So subsequently follows for the urban small, Yelm receives the full share. It's like 700,000 in urban small funding, with the difference made up with other grant programs. Thurston County would receive 600,000 for the Sargent Road to Elderberry project. It would receive its full request of 700,000 STBG rural and all 600,000 STBG flexible for the old Highway 99 at the intersection of Sargent Road, because that is their rural community support program project they wanted the funding to award to. TRPC's Trails Plan implementation only scoring 5 points. There's no other STBG funding to award. In this baseline scenario, no funding for TRPC on the Trails Plan. Next slide. Transportation alternatives, only 2 proposals. Intercity Transit gets its full request. No award for the Chehalis Western Trail Preservation. Next slide. Carbon Reduction Program funding. We received 4 proposals. In this scenario, we are funding phase 4, but we're funding it with CMAQ. And I'll give you the details of what grant funding for which proposal in the next slides. For this, I'm just showing you how scenario 1 will differ from scenario 2. So intercity transit, full funding for Smart Corridors phase 4. And we're giving extra funding to Thurston County's Chehalis Western Trail Preservation Project. It would receive all the urban large and rural funding because they submitted an additional TA proposal requesting additional funding because the demand is there for preservation needs on the Chehalis Western Trail. Next slide. We only received 2 CMAQ proposals. Both would be fully funded. Deschutes Valley Trail Segment C, this is for construction. Tumwater in scenario 1 would be awarded $2,595,000, and Intercity Transit's battery electric dial-up vehicles with charging infrastructure $1,065,680,000. Next slide. So the real difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2 is finding funding for the regional trails plan. TRPC submitted a request for $650,000. There's 34 policy recommendations in the trails plan that establishing an advisory work group would be focusing on. Be able to look at things like what are the long-term pavement needs? Where are areas on the trail network that would stand to be safer with some added lighting and street crossing improvements? How could we improve wayfinding signage on the network? And doing that coordination with the trail managing agencies in Thurston County. It would also allow us to perform a 5-year plan update to the trails plan, which that clock starts ticking after the regional transportation plan is adopted. So we're looking at like around 2029 to do that work, and then do 5 annual trail planning summits that would be more public facing meetings to engage the community overall on what the trail managing agencies are doing to expand, enhance, and improve the safety of the trail network. So with the partial award, click please, Berlina, for 500,000 partial award, this would include a lighter update for that 5-year update, where we would only be looking at updating maps and data and reviewing and updating the recommendations where appropriate. We would still establish and convene that Trails Advisory Work Group meeting quarterly, but instead of doing 5 annual summits over the course of that funding cycle, we would only be able to do 2 summit meetings. So that's the difference with the partial award that if funded, TRC would be able to accomplish. But I want to be clear, this funding wouldn't come to TRPC until 2029. So we're still looking for funding to fill that gap between now and when we would be able to obligate this award. Next, Berlina. And to be clear, TRPC can only use surface transportation block grant funding for these planning activities. And we need a share of both urban and rural allocations because the entire county is our planning area. So we would need a combination of urban and rural to do some of that work. Next slide.
These amounts of money though are for five years.
That's
Not-
right. That,
Not each year, but 5 years total. Those are 5-year totals, so it's 560.
that 500,000 partial award would be for 5 years of funding or the 650 as well.
Okay.
Okay, so here's all of award scenario 1 stacked together. It's kind of small, that's why I broke it out. But here I just want to show you that difference. So scenario 1 and scenario 2 side by side. The recommendation that I'm presenting to you today is scenario 2. That's the TPB's subcommittee's recommendation that they help inform. Go ahead and click, Berlina. The difference really here is about providing that partial funding for the regional trails plan, that $500,000. Where does that come from? Because in award scenario 1, we need to draw STBG funding from proposals. So how do we do that? Go ahead and click through your Berlina. So first we pull 200,000 from the City of Lacey's Pacific Avenue Enhanced Crosswalks project. Thank you, Olympia. And then we pull 200,000 STBG from the College Street corridor improvements. Next. And then we pull 100,000 from the rural funding that we had assigned or allocated to the Chehalis Western Trail Preservation. So in total, we have 500,000 in STBG funds drawn from those 3 projects. But then to cover the difference for the City of Lacey's College Street corridor improvements, go ahead and click, Berlina. We're taking $200,000 in CMAQ funding. In scenario 1, looking at the bottom and the totals, scenario 1, we had programmed out 19,141,515. You can see in scenario 2, we're programming out the full amount. The difference here was we still had nearly $43,000 in CMAQ funding unprogrammed in scenario 1, but with scenario 2, we're just putting that 42,000 in some change towards intercity transit smart corridors phase 4 project. So in scenario 2, the real difference that you see here is that TRPC's Trails Plan implementation is 150,000 short, and intercity transit's smart corridors phase 4 is 158,180 short from its full award. That is the difference between scenario 1 and 2. Next slide. So we're going to move on to the recommendations. Staff is recommending that the policy board recommend to the council awarding the $550,000 in rural community support program funding to Yokota's sidewalk replacement on Main Street project, Rainier's citywide thermoplastic striping project, and the Nisqually Indian Tribe Camas Road Extension project for a total of $550,000. Next slide. For carbon reduction program, we're consolidating Thurston County's pavement preservation, urban, rural, and its TA request into one proposal for a total award of CRP funding of $1,271,020 for Yelt's Roton Road construction, all of the urban small allocation of CRP of $437,097. So totally programming out all carbon reduction programming funding to these 2 projects. Next slide. For CMAQ funding, 5 million, I'm gonna say CMAQ saved our call for projects process. We were able to fund more proposals as a result of receiving this allocation. The recommendation is fully funding Deschutes Valley Trail Segment C for 2,595,000. Fully funding intercity transit's battery electric dial-up vehicles with charging infrastructure for 1,065,680,000. Fully funding intercity transit smart corridors phase 4. Not fully funding, partially funding with CMAQ in lieu of CRP for 1,139,320, and making up Lacey's difference in its STBG request with the $200,000 CMAQ grant funding. So all CMAQ funding is programmed out with this scenario 2 recommendation. Next slide. For transportation alternatives, fully funding the walk and roll program for school years 2027 through 2030. This is a combination of urban large and flexible TA for a total of 1,623,232. Using the urban small and a share of flexible TA funding to supplement Yelm's STBG funding, 501,768 in TA funding to the Roton Road Northwest reconstruction. This would go towards their bicycle, pedestrian, shared use trail facilities as part of that project's construction. And for Thurston County, for the consolidated Chehalis Western Trail pavement preservation, we have 350,000 in rural EA funding. That's the appropriate place to put it. So programming out all 2,475,000 TA funding to these 3 projects. Next slide. And final recommendation for surface transportation block grant awards. We had 10 million to program, fully funding the City of Olympia's Martin Way Corridor project for 2.5 million. The City of Olympia's Pacific Avenue Enhanced Crosswalks, 200,000 less than what they requested for 1,300,000. Lacey's College Street corridor improvements, partial STBG award of 1,338,284. Old Pacific Highway Coleman Road partial award of 1,661,716. Yelms Roton Road Northwest reconstruction. This is the share of urban small and STBG flexible of 1,738,865. As you can see, we're really trying to leverage as much funding towards Yelms Roton Road project as we can in this call. For Thurston County's 196th Avenue Southwest Sargent Road to Elderberry Road, 600,000. All of the 700,000 rural STBG funding to the county's Tilley Road Bridge replacement. And the remaining 600,000 STBG flexible to Thurston County's old Highway 99 at the intersection of Sargent Road, which is an important project because it helps support the Rural Community Support Program. And lastly, the subcommittee's recommendation for a partial award of 500,000 for the Regional Trails Plan implementation. Next slide. So here is just a summary of all the federal awards by applicants so that you can see what applicants have requested and what the scenario 2 award recommendation provides. Trying to really maximize that funding. I think this recommendation helps TRPC achieve the objectives in our call for projects process. Next slide. And then we have a contingency list. As I showed you on one of the earlier slides, we had a gap of 4,845,380. Here's the difference. In this 2024 call for projects, we funded all 19 proposals except for 2. Thurston County's Meridian Road, Mullen Road, Southeast Improvements, and the Trosper Road Mobility Study. Both of those were really steady projects, great projects for being on the contingency list. So as funding becomes available, we would program or coordinate with WashDOT and the applicant to try to secure some of this funding to make up the differences in their funding needs. These amounts here are what would go on the contingency list, but this would change over time to account for inflation. And I just want to point out that even though Lacey's difference here is that 570,000 in CRP, Lacey still needs about $2 to $3 million in funding to complete their right-of-way phase. Next slide. So our action today, staff, we're asking you to approve the recommendations for the 3 rural community support program proposals and approve the federal funding recommendations as presented for carbon reduction program, CMAQ, transportation alternatives, and surface transportation block program. That's the end of my presentation. If Brilliant, if you could stop sharing, I would invite the chair and the other subcommittee members to share their insights about their meeting and the process and the formation of these award recommendations.
Sure, I'll get started. I think it's a good reminder that as we're going through this process, that that the scoring that we've come up with is just one tool in the toolbox that we use to award these funds. You know, there's a lot of history here of how we've done how we've funded projects over the years. We knew that we needed to look at a scoring process, but this policy board has you know, didn't go to the as far as say that the projects that scored the highest will always receive the highest dollar amounts, because we can see from this list we have a bunch of priority projects that we believe are priority projects that might not score well on you know, in our normal scoring. So for example, the trail implementation plan, you know, here we are, we know it's a priority for our region and it doesn't score very well, but we are trying to find ways to get it funded. And so I think the subcommittee going through the process, I think we always need to be able to adjust you know, on the fly, because it's, you know, we have to meet reality too. But I think overall we're headed in the right direction. We have a good idea of what our priorities are, but at the end of the day, this is a complicated math problem. Every time we go through this, there's always more projects out there than we can than funding is available. So we just need to take tools that we have and try to best meet the real life scenarios on the ground. And I think this proposal's done that. Of course, I would love to see the full funding of our trail implementation, but we had to sort of compromise to get any funding over to our trails implementation. But I think we're headed in the right direction. I feel good about this recommendation, and I will be supporting it. Does anyone else have any questions, or anyone else from the subcommittee want to talk? Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, so yeah, it was a very good conversation. I also support this recommendations. I want to make sure that, and I want to make emphasis that, to Karen's comments, that we do find that funding over the next few years to ensure that the trails program is funded. You know, I've talked to staff about making the reductions before I forwarded that reduction for our projects in Olympia, and we support that because it is an important project that needs to move forward on our regional trails. And so I support where we're going forward.
Michelle?
This was my first opportunity to be a part of this process and, you know, being able to get behind the scenes. It wasn't an easy decision. Like every project deserved funding. But when you've got to cut $5 million, that's a lot. And that means some very worthy projects didn't score as well. But the committee, the group really looked at trying to make it equitable. Like we talked about the trails, we talked about carbon reduction, and we talked we talked about what do we want Thurston County to look like going forward. So there was a lot of discussions and it wasn't an easy decision. And I'm just glad I could be part of that process and see where those things are at and know that Thurston County is moving forward in a direction that serves its citizens.
Justin?
Yeah, I also support this this scenario moving forward, and while there's certainly a lot of lessons learned and I think opportunities for process improvement, like it's been discussed earlier, I think a lot of our individual projects are well supported, in addition to some mutually beneficial projects that will get to move forward. So, yeah, I think it was a pleasure to be a part of the process, and I look forward to improving upon it in the future, and excited to see so much move forward.
So, Travis?
Yeah, I also found it to be a rewarding process, and just wanted to give a shout out and some kudos to Paul and the TRPC staff for taking this this puzzle, all these different projects and the money that we had, and coming up with some scenarios for us to review ahead of time. I found that immensely helpful, rather than just saying, okay, guys, here's a big pot of money, figure out what to do with it. I think it really expedited the process to have several different scenarios to go over. So I just wanted to, again, give credit where it's due, because I found that really helpful.
And I do want to say that I'm really proud that the policy board has always supported our trails and our trail network, and has been a big advocate for our implementation of our trails plan. As has been pointed out, that funding is not coming for a while, and I would hope that we could, if funding becomes available before then, that we can figure out how to get it funded, because I don't particularly want to wait all the way to 2029 to start doing the implementation part of the trails plan. So I think that's something that we need to think about. Is there a way that we can move funding around if it becomes available to do the implementation earlier than that? So I think that's something that we'll need to look on the contingency list, and where other sources become available, just be ready to take advantage of that. So what I've heard is,
Chair, I would just like to add from a staff perspective, this was the first time that we had this subcommittee of the policy board dig deeper, and it was really helpful. Having some people get into the weeds with us of the challenges of finding the right urban large and the right thing for carbon reduction program, and trying to make all those pieces fit together. We are seeing places for process improvement, and that will be continuous. No scoring process, no evaluation process is ever perfect. And having some more people kind of dig into the details, I think was tremendously helpful. So I hope this was the first of an ongoing TPB subcommittee to look at call for projects in the future.
yeah, I look forward to having future discussions about CRP and funding and what's the appropriate use of those funds. Obviously, this time around, we've all agreed that CRP funding should go to our trails network in maintenance and preservation. I think, I'm supportive of that going forward as well. And then the scoring process, we can take a look at that going forward too. There's always room for improvement. And but again, as we just went through this process, we just used the scoring as just a tool. Obviously we didn't go straight the highest scores get the highest amount of dollars. That's not it was never our intention to do it that way, but it is a good check-in to see how our projects that we're recommending, do they meet the goals of our region? Tracy, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Andy. I just think it's important that to speak up here for us down in South County. I understand the process and appreciate its effectiveness. However, the concern I would have down here is there's quite the funding for the Thurston, or excuse me, for the intercity transit. Now, I don't know how often you guys get to drive by the facility out there, but it's beautiful. We're all paying sales tax on this, and I guess I don't understand why we're giving them even more money when they clearly have a lot of money. Secondly, especially this time of year, the trails are important, but I think we have, in our opinions out here in South County, I believe we have the roads are in much more need of funding out here than the trail system. But that's all I got.
Thank you, Tracy. So what I've heard overall is in the recommendation from the subcommittee is in support of the scenario 2 from the staff recommendations. Is there a motion?
Andy, there's a hand in the room.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Andy, thanks a lot. The trails that we have that are in desperate need of repair and preservation, which leads to physical safety. But for some time, I've been harping on the safety issue of our trails in general. I think what we need to do is to come up with a more tangible definition of what safety is. Not just repairing the trails and putting up signs, but to make sure that people aren't being hurt on the trails from other people. Without a definite definition of what we mean, or what I hope we mean by safety, we can't seek funds for it. So I would recommend that at some point that we put together a subcommittee to actually look at what safety concerns there really are. I've talked to some people that use the path on a regular basis, and they say once it starts getting a little bit darker, they don't want to use them anymore because they're afraid of what's going on. I worked security. I got to see what happens when the lights go out, and it's not pretty. But we have no funding for it. Without a solid definition of what we mean by physical safety, we're never going to be able to say we need this kind of money to do these kind of things.
Yeah. Well, that's why the trail implementation plan is so important, and why we want.
I'm not saying that. Yeah. I'm saying that that's just another step that we should be looking at that we don't look at. To me, and everybody here knows that I've never been really big on trails, but what everybody should know by now is that I'm real big on the safety of the people that are using those trails. The preservation is part of that safety, but policing of some sort needs to happen as well, because we've got 4 people in Thurston County that take care of all of our parks and take care of all of our trails, but they can come up to somebody and say, don't do this. If the person says, okay, not a problem, then that's fine. But they have no authority to say, you can't do this. And by the time they call the police, that person's gone. We need to help that part of our population that makes it even more amicable to use those trails, not just during daylight hours, But like right now, people are going, you know, well, for example, us, it was still dark when I came out here. I'm not riding that trail in the dark. Not the way that it is right now, and it's not because of the preservation part, it's because I don't know what spooks are out in the bushes. We've seen it happen, and the more population we get, the worse it's going to get.
Okay,
With that said, I will make the motion to approve Plan B, or
Scenario two.
Second,
scenario 2.
And the
Okay.
second was Ron Kemp.
yes,
Thank you.
Okay, there's a motion and second to approve the staff recommendation of scenario 2 for the this federal funding cycle. Is there any further discussion?
I do have a comment.
Go ahead, Pete.
One of the things that, when you present this to the full board, I would suggest, because I'm looking at table 2, which I understand summarizes the scenario 2 pretty concisely, is having the years that money becomes available for each of those awards, I think would be helpful for perspective on it. I am concerned that it's gonna be 5 years before we're able to implement the plan, and I think the concern that was raised earlier about safety, you know, that's addressed in the plan, and that's part of the reason for an advisory committee is to talk about those issues and see if we can influence policymakers to do that. So I do hope that it is. I can't remember if it's on the contingency list for it is. Okay, so hopefully some money will become available, and that would be one of the things that we might be able to get started on before now and then.
As staff, we have heard that message loud and clear, and we will be looking for any way we can get funding sooner to get that work going.
Right, well, I just wanna, I think I wanna just say thanks to the staff that submitted these proposals to come up with them and sort of constrain themselves. You can ask for a lot more money, but I think they were realistic in their asks and what they could achieve. And also, of course, appreciate the subcommittee's work and PRPC's staff and the TAC work and just trying to sort this all out. It is a very complicated and difficult thing to kind of put all these pieces together, but I think you've done a really good job, and I really appreciate the work everybody's done here. So thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul and staff, Berlina and everyone for, this is like I said, an extremely difficult math problem. Every time we've done this, it's not easy because all these projects are great projects, and we have to figure out how we can maximize these federal dollars that are really expensive to use, and we understand that as well. And so it's a difficult process. It's one of the most difficult things that we do, I think, in our region, but we've always been able to come together and figure out a path forward and try to maximize these dollars to make sure these projects move forward. So thank you again. We've made it through one more funding cycle, and so that's been successful. So I really appreciate it. So we have a motion and a second. Is there any more discussion?
Chair, just note that Tracy Wood's hand is up. It may be from before, but
No, I
just
think
wanted to make
it's-
sure
yeah.
before you take a vote.
It was still up.
Okay,
So all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Raise your hand.
aye,
Aye.
aye,
Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that motion unanimously carries. You know, and if you would like someone from the Transportation Policy Board to make this recommendation to the full council, we haven't ever really done that in the past, but I could try to find a way to either myself or someone from the subcommittee be there to report out to TRPC on this recommendation and answer any questions the full board may have of us as well. So that's just a food for thought going forward.
great.
Thank you.
Yep. So our last agenda item are the RTP project list and financial forecast presentation. Trina.
Right, give me just a minute to get this pulled up. Excuse me. All right, good morning again. So I'm going to be talking you through the financial forecast for the Regional Transportation Plan and the project list. These are two big important components to the RTP. And just to kind of put it in perspective, we have 5 topic areas that will be coming to you to talk about the Regional Transportation Plan on. We've already come to you about climate change. We plan on coming to you about equity and future conditions in the future. Today, we're talking about 2 of these components, which is the project list and the financial forecast. So I'll start with the project list. So the project list legislation at both state and federal levels requires the RTP to be financially constrained. And basically what that means is that we have to have enough money for funding the projects in the plan. So there's this big dance between the project list and the financial forecast and making sure that the 2 are consistent with one another and that there is enough funding in the plan to do the projects that we've said we anticipate seeing over the next 25 years. So what's changed? If you look at the current plan, 2045 is the future year. We have 72 projects. The 2050 plan, as it stands right now, will have 79. We've seen 10 projects completed, 2 projects were removed, and there are 19 new projects. And that list, a complete list of projects in the proposed for the 2050 plan is in your packet. So the completed projects, what we see is most of them are studies. So we've done a lot of the groundwork to move forward with implementation of projects. Some of the projects that you see on this list are still underway. An example of that is the Rochester Grand Mountain Trail feasibility study. But we're expecting things like that to be completed by the time the RTP is anticipated to be adopted in July. So there's been a lot of good groundwork that's been done in the last 5 years that will support future work that jurisdictions and agencies want to see completed. 2 projects are being removed. These are the Rural Transportation Funding Strategy and the Urban Strategy Corridors Evaluation. So with regard to the Rural Transportation Funding Strategy, this is a really hard topic to pin down a project TRPC can do. What does it mean to have a rural transportation funding strategy, and how can TRPC impact that moving forward? And so when we considered, why do we have this project in the plan and what are we doing? We looked at what we're actually doing right now, and instead TRPC is concentrating its efforts on maintaining the Rural Community Support Program that Paul just talked about with the call for projects proposals and funding recommendation and advocating for rural funding at the state and federal level. So just to put this in perspective, TRPC's 2025 legislative priorities, which includes a request for almost $35 million for a funding package for South County community transportation projects. This is an example of how we are advocating and trying to see funding come to our rural communities, more rural communities. Thurston County continues to be a great partner in the Rural Community Support Program, and we hope to maintain that relationship in the future and future calls for project. And in addition to this, TRPC is continuing to monitor rural funding opportunities, including WashDOT's Federal Fund Exchange pilot program, which allows rural counties to swap federal funding for state funding. As they are going through that process, we hope that it will continue and that it will be opened up for other opportunities for rural communities, not just rural counties. The second project is the Urban Strategies Corridors Evaluation. And this would have evaluated strategies that address congestion and mobility in the region's designated strategy corridors. And if that sounds familiar, with our recent development of a congestion management process, which was approved by council, was it last week or the week before? That includes most of the region's urban strategy corridors. And so just on the face of it, this project isn't needed any longer because it's incorporated into that congestion management process. So 19 new projects. This is really exciting. And what we're seeing is that there are a lot of good projects coming up. Some of them will sound familiar because you just went through the call for projects process and your recommendation. And some of those projects are on this list. An example of that is Smart Corridors Phase 4. So a lot of really good projects coming forward. A lot of them are IT projects, which is great to see as well. So with that in hand, 79 projects in the plan, how do they stack up and how do they impact the financial forecast? And again, federal and state law requires the regional transportation plan to be financially constrained. We have to make sure that what we're spending on transportation doesn't exceed the revenues that we anticipate. And so this is kind of split into two pieces for us. We look at transit and looking at intercity transit's long-range plan and the rural transit grants that sustain rural transit. For jurisdictions, we look at the RTP project list. And I should note for the intercity transit long-range plan, their transit projects are included in that. So those are represented there. But for the jurisdictions, we look at the RTP project list. We look at historical BARS data, and that is the budgeting, accounting, and reporting system that jurisdictions use to be consistent across the state with how they're reporting funding, whether it's being spent or entered in or received. We look at the state's gas tax forecast. We look at transportation benefit district fees that the jurisdictions are receiving, as well as possible future TBD fees. And then we make an assumption about new state funding that the region will receive. So transit's the easy one because we just have two sources of information. We go to Interstate Transit and ask them about what their revenue and expenditures look like. And we look at RT's grant cycles and what we are anticipating receiving and requesting to sustain that service. What we're seeing is that revenues support funding of regional projects for transit. And what we also see is that we see banking funding for projects in later years. So essentially what's happening is we're getting to the point where we, as a region, have to save up funding. And the first portion of the, I apologize, those dates are wrong. And so it should be 2025 to 2050. Oh, never mind. I got myself confused, but I'm just comparing, what happened in the current plan and what we see versus. Oh my gosh, guys, I am so sorry. This slide is very confusing. But the idea is that in 2025 to 2040, and then 2050. I'm just going to move on. That slide is just not in the right place. But the message is that we've got to bank up funding for projects so that they can be implemented in the second half of the forecast period. So what we see surplus in the first half is going to be spent in the second half. When you look at transportation revenue, historic revenue. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry, guys. Let's take a step back. So now we're going to talk about county transportation revenue. And this is historically what the county has spent on transportation, or what the county has received for transportation revenue, and how they've brought it in. Most of what they bring in for supporting transportation purposes is from property taxes. Other local funds also is a big portion of it. You see some funding from state fuel tax as well. There are other state funds that come in through grants and other things, and same thing with federal. So this is kind of the breakdown of historically the revenue the county has received for transportation work. City and town transportation revenue looks very different. It's a big piece of that is the other local funds, which is sales and use tax, business and occupation tax, real estate excise tax, and other things. So there's a big difference between how the county and the jurisdictions can bring in revenue for transportation purposes. And there's a little bit different mix as well in those other pieces. So state fuel tax, for example, that distribution to cities and towns is only 5% versus the county's 14%. So when you look at the state fuel tax forecast, we know that that is going down over time. I think you can kind of see that in the first portion of that chart. County revenues fluctuate due to some competitive funds, and that's really from the County Road Administration Board. And so when we are projecting that forward and trying to understand how much we're going to receive, we took an average there. City and town funds are formula distributed, so it's a little bit smoother when you look at the current years or the historical years. And based on state revenue forecast, which for the fuel tax forecast, they project that out to 2033. This is kind of what we anticipate our region receiving. The one big caveat here is that, again, we know that the fuel tax forecast, we are seeing less and less money coming into that fund and distributed to the state because of fuel efficiency of cars and people making other choices about how to travel in the community. And so one of the assumptions is that a road usage charge over time is going to replace that fuel tax. This is something that you should anticipate hearing about in the next legislative session. So we'll see how things shake out, but at this stage, TRPC is assuming that the road usage charge over time will replace the fuel tax. We are not assuming an increase in receiving revenue for that. We're just taking it where it sits in our 2025 and projecting it out to 2050. And so when you see that gradual increase on state fuel tax forecast in the future years, that is solely increases based on increasing populations to this region. So as the state continues to work on how to address the change in how people travel and what that fuel tax mix looks like, we'll probably have better ideas in the future, but right now we're just assuming it's going to be a straight changeover and that we aren't going to see increasing revenues due to that. So the other big piece here to the financial forecast is transportation benefit district funding. We have existing revenues that Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater all collect. And so when you look at the historical information for 2010 to 2023 roughly, that is reality of what has been collected for the jurisdictions because of them establishing these transportation benefit district funds. We are assuming that new revenues will be collected. As you may know, Thurston County does have a transportation benefit district. They are not currently collecting on that. Our assumption is that in 2027, they will start collecting that. We also assume that eventually Yelm will start collecting a retail sales TBD, but not till kind of halfway through the forecast period. We also assume that there will be increased revenues from those those TBDs. So Olympia will increase its retail sales in 2035, and that Thurston County's car tab would increase in 2040. So I want to note that these are all TRPC's assumptions. They are not assumptions, or they're not, the jurisdictions are not beholden to these assumptions. So in 5 years, we will reassess where things sit and look at whether we need to adjust these assumptions.
Crystal ball.
It's a crystal ball, exactly. And whether you believe crystal balls or not, that is a great question. Jurisdiction revenue forecast. So when you take all these different pieces, the local base funding that jurisdictions receive, the transportation benefit district funding that they receive, existing state funding, new state funding and federal, this is what our revenue collections look like over the forecast period. So we're looking at more than $125 million received on an annual basis at the end of the forecast for the region to work on transportation projects. One of the big assumptions here is that we have to make an assumption about state funding, new state funding. And we assume that about 190 million in additional state revenue for major transportation projects will come to our region. This is talking about is there will be one or more new transportation packages similar to Connecting Washington passed by the state legislature and so we're assuming that through that process, $190 million will come to the region. This is a really reasonable assumption because when you look at Connecting Washington package, that is funding $191 million of projects in Thurston County. That included the diverging diamond at Marvin Road and I-5, WashDOT's Olympic Region Maintenance and Administration Facility. The Yelm Loop is being funded through Connecting Washington, and that should be starting construction next year. And then Mottman Road pedestrian street improvements, that's a City of Olympia project. So I do want to note that when we look at the list of projects that Connecting Washington has funded in our region, most of those are WashDOT projects. And I think what we're going to start seeing is that given where the jurisdictions are, the low-hanging, easier projects to complete with federal dollar or with, just in general are going away. They're not there anymore. And so it's those harder projects that are more difficult to fund and find funding for that are starting to bubble up for our jurisdictions. And so I think what we're going to see is a shift from, those legislative transportation packages funding WashDOT projects, but seeing it more affect the jurisdictions directly. Now, that said, the big elephant in the room is I-5, Marvin to Mount Road. And updating that Nisqually crossing and those bridges. That is such a big project. We're talking over $1 billion, that is going to require above and beyond what a state legislative funding package can do. So there may be funding for that there, but a lot of it, we're also going to be having to look at the federal government for. And so the assumption is that $190 million isn't going to be necessarily for I-5, is going to be for the local jurisdiction projects.
The most recent update on the cost estimate for Nisqually Mounts to Marvin is $3 to $6 billion.
That's if we started yesterday.
Exactly. All right, so we've talked about revenue. So what about the expenditures that the jurisdictions can expect over the forecast period? So again, that's 2025 to 2050. We still kind of split things up a little bit. About 18% of all those funds we expect to be spent on regional projects. And again, those are the jurisdictions projects in that project list that you saw. Almost a quarter of it is going to be spent on baseline maintenance, preservation, and operations. And then another 18% is on just solely preservation, and that's through the Transportation Benefit District funds. What we are seeing is that those TBD funds are becoming a critical piece in our jurisdictions being able to maintain and preserve the transportation system. It's pumped in a lot of opportunities for the City of Olympia, City of Lacey, and City of Tumwater. And so they're just becoming more and more critical to making sure that our transportation system, and by that I do mean our roads, are able to function and be safe for our community. And the one thing to note is that for this financial forecast, TRPC is assuming that 95% of those transportation benefit district dollars are going to preservation, not to other purposes. So again, just a very critical piece in ensuring our system is being maintained. Speaking of which, so this is just a comparison of what we see for spending on average per year for maintenance. And what we see is that generally speaking, between 2000 and 2021, base funding for maintenance, preservation operations really doesn't change that much, didn't grow. And again, we're assuming 95% of those TBD funds goes to road preservation. So when you see the breakdown of all of that preservation dollars, you can see how much, how critical it is that if we're going to preserve our system, then those TBD funds are coming into play. You know, in the current plan, the estimate is that jurisdictions need collectively $25 million a year to maintain the system. This kind of goes to show you how, again, how critical those dollars are to not only maintaining the system, but also seeing that backlog of maintenance being addressed. So when we look at the jurisdiction revenue versus expenditures, this is very similar to what we talked about with transit. We are seeing a banking of funding in the first portion of the forecast so that it can pay for projects in the second half. And again, we're just seeing bigger projects that require more resources to be complete. And so we have to bank those dollars to make sure that they can happen. And again, apologies for this slide, the dates are wrong. I will make sure that that is corrected before this gets sent out to you. So when we take public transportation as well as the jurisdictions and what they are spending on transportation purposes, what we see is that public transportation is the biggest share of how we are spending our local transportation dollars. Maintenance and preservation of local streets is still a big portion. Local projects, when you pull it all together, is a small portion as well, but and same with regional projects, but public transportation is kind of the biggest share. And there's a reason for that. When you look at this, when you look at public transit, you're talking about not only the infrastructure is the buses, but you also have the operators. And so when you pull those two pieces together, it's no wonder that it's such a big piece. The other thing to note is that IT is planning a lot of great work in the next 25 years. We're talking about system expansion, service expansions, higher frequency of service. And so those are all really important pieces to making sure that our system runs efficiently and is available to people who do not have access to a car or have lesser access to being able to do what maybe most of us are able to do, which is just get in our car and go where we want when we want. So that's that. So with that, I just want to note that our next steps are that in January, we anticipate coming to you to talk about equity in the plan. And then in February, we will be coming to talk to you about future conditions and asking for a recommendation on releasing the plan to the general public for comment and review. The plan at this stage is to have that public comment process happen in April. We'll start reviewing those comments with you in May and then go through the final steps of adopting the plan in June and July. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. there might be a lot, but it's a big piece, this funding process.
Any questions? Robert?
Yeah, so my question is, with this financial forecast, do you have any, well, first off, later if you could email me the slides, that would be wonderful. But let's say a city decides to do a shift in its investment and does road diets and moves away from having to pay for essentially overbuilt roads, and makes that shift. How do you calculate that financial forecast if a city moves away from being a car-centric place?
So I think there's two pieces there. One is that in order to project forward, we do rely on historical data. So if there is a big shift in how the jurisdiction splits its funding and where it goes to for revenue and expenditures, it's probably not going to tell very well. But where it does tell is what is the project list that the jurisdiction is putting forward. So if it is putting forward a road diet for a street or a corridor, more sidewalks, et cetera, that's where it's going to see a shift in spending. Is it just on the road surface, or is it on those ancillary, also important pieces of the road infrastructure?
And I'd also add, since we do update this plan every 5 years, that is a regular look at all of these assumptions. Every 5 years, we'll come back to these assumptions and make any updates as if we start to see trends in differences that any of the jurisdictions are experiencing in how they're spending transportation dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Pete. Just a question on you had mentioned the banking of funds. Of course, a lot of these funds are grants. You can't really bank them. You have to spend them when you get them. So I can understand there's a sort of an assumption in this plan, but the reality is if the money's there, we're going to spend it, right? So I'm not quite sure
Well, not all
how that jives with reality.
Yeah, not all the funding comes through grants. So, and often there are matching requirements. So we have to make an assumption that, for those big projects that are going to cost $50 million to complete, the jurisdiction is going to have to bank that funding or match before it can actually get to the point where it can construct. So.
And really, when we using the term banking, it's more that as we look through that horizon of 25 years, costs are going to continue to go up. The harder projects take longer to get done. There's going to be more spending in those out years than in the first 10, 15 years.
Okay.
You're just trying to come up with a scenario where it could actually get funded. So
that's right, because just a reminder, it is our responsibility, requirement to have a financially constrained plan. So we have to reasonably be able to lay out how we would have the funding to cover what we have in the plan. As Katrina just went through, that's based on a lot of assumptions. We will, every 5 years, again, we'll be updating those assumptions. And if ever we get to a point where we don't have a financially constrained plan, then we would be coming to you all because we have to. So it'd be looking at what are we going to take out to make sure that we have a reasonable assumption of having the funds to support the plan.
Yeah, which is such a difficult thing.
It is.
Always comes back to the vision and the actual reality, and so there's always a divide there, but we do the best we can with the information that we have.
That's right.
Okay, is there anyone else? Anyone else have any questions?
One more question, Andy. How did you factor in impact fees and mitigation, secret mitigation fees, or I didn't see you mention them?
Those are not included in the forecast. So when we were working this through with our technical advisory committee, they did ask about those impact fees. And we're not quite to the point where we can factor those in. So they're not represented there unless the jurisdiction has it in their bars data. And some of them do, some of them don't, from what I understand. So we need to do a little more refining on that to incorporate that into assumptions.
Yeah, that's how Lacey pays for a lot of our transportation projects is through traffic mitigation fees. So that's something that probably should be looked at some point. Okay. Well, with that, it looks like we reached the end of our agenda. Everyone's staying dry back home. And without objection, I'll call this meeting adjourned.
Non-debatable.
Thank you. See ya. Made it.
I apologize.